For this invitation to take part in this webinar this morning. I regret that my intervention is going to take the form of a video presentation, which means that I won't be able to take part in the ensuing debate. But I do hope that the comments that I make can provide some input into the subsequent discussions. Let me begin by reminding you of what's been happening to agricultural emissions. We've seen a fall of around 20% in emissions between 1990 and 2018. But that fall took place entirely prior to 2012. And since then, we've seen emissions, in fact, slightly increase. These are emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. There are also emissions from agricultural land use, which are reported in the LULUCF sector. The LULUCF sector as a whole is, of course, a sink in the EU because of forestry and harvested wood products, but that sink has also been shrinking in recent years. And the problem is that if we look at member state projections to 2030, we see no sign of improvement. In fact, it's expected that agricultural emissions with existing measures in place will be more or less at the same level in 2030 as they were in 2015. There's some variation across member states. The Nordics are not particularly good performers. Denmark expects a reduction of 1%, Finland just under 3%, Sweden of 9%. But it's clear from these figures that we need a much more ambitious policy to address these emissions in the coming period. I suspect everybody by now is familiar with the outlines of the new CAP, and in particular its green architecture. So enhanced conditionality for direct payments, the new eco schemes in Pillar 1, and the continuation of voluntary climate, agri-environment climate measures in Pillar 2. What's perhaps less appreciated is that we're going to see a fairly dramatic increase in spending on environmental and climate measures in the next CAP. This increase could be up to 6 times what is currently being spent. It'll probably be somewhat less than that because some member states already spend more than the minimum on the agri-environment climate measures in Pillar 2, and some of the additional spending will be allocated to animal welfare rather than to the environment and climate specifically. But there will be considerably larger funding available for the member states. And the question is really going to be the quality of that spending. Will member states really use these funds to effectively promote the green transition in agriculture? And I think one important standard to hold the strategic plans to account on will be the extent to which they focus on reducing these non-CO2 emissions of methane and nitrous oxide from agricultural production. There's been much debate about the way in which the various targets that have been set out in the farm to fork strategy, for example, reductions in the use of pesticides, reductions in the use of fertilizers, the expanded area under organic farming, how they will be reflected in the member state strategic plans. What's clear is that achieving these targets would have important co-benefits in terms of reducing emissions. The effect of the strategy will be to extensify production, and as I've argued, this will only reduce global emissions if, in addition, the consumption of animal source foods is reduced. And the strategy for the first time takes a food systems approach, but the specific interventions that are proposed to shift consumer preferences and demand seem, rather weak. There's a lot of emphasis put on the potential for these plant-based protein substitutes in both meat and dairy to be the game changer to actually bring about that necessary change in consumer preferences. The Commission has also proposed the Fit for 55 package to revise many elements of its climate architecture in order to achieve the more ambitious 2030 and 2050 targets set out in the climate law. Several elements in this package will have implications for agricultural and land emissions, including the higher reduction targets for the sectors covered by the effort sharing regulation, including agriculture, revised accounting methods in the LULUCF sector, and more stringent removals targets. But here I want to raise two questions. And the first concerns the external dimension of climate policy. It's clear that food will not be covered by the Commission's proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is intended to reduce the loss of competitiveness and carbon leakage in certain industrial sectors. Farm interests argue that it's unfair that they should have to compete with imports that do not face the same climate requirements. Now, we could debate whether this is a legitimate grievance or not, but what I want to highlight here is that the Commission has been asked to produce a report next year on the feasibility of extending EU health and environmental standards to imported food. So it's going to be interesting to see whether climate requirements are included in that. The other issue concerns the Commission's proposal to create the so-called AFOLU sector, so combining the agriculture and LULUCF sectors into a single sector and giving them a target, a net zero target by 2035, and thereafter the creation of negative emissions, which could be used to offset emissions in other sectors. Now, there are arguments for and against. On the one hand, I think it makes sense to treat emissions from agriculture and from agricultural land together, because the same farmers are making decisions about both. And the Commission does see significant potential in its so-called carbon farming initiative, which is designed to create a new revenue stream for farmers. Although I do see considerable practical problems in making this a credible mechanism in the future. On the other hand, environmental NGOs have been in favor of keeping removals separate from targets to reduce emissions. Although this seems hard to square with the net zero ambition in the Paris Agreement and the EU's own net zero target for 2050. So in conclusion, I argue that, in the absence of additional measures, there's no evidence that agricultural emissions are going to fall. I think there's some grounds for optimism in the revised CAP, in the farm to fork strategy, and in the more ambitious targets in the climate law. What we see is more emphasis being put on creating removals, so the carbon farming initiative, rather than on reducing agricultural emissions of methane and nitrous oxide per se. Although the proposed extensification of agriculture in the farm to fork strategy would contribute to reducing these emissions, although at the risk of displacing emissions abroad. So what we do need are both technological abatement options that will allow production that continues to be produced with fewer emissions, but we also need this strong shift in consumption and in consumer preferences. But here I remark that the toolbox seems limited. There's a lot of emphasis placed on the potential for the alternative protein sector to be a game changer, but whether this optimism is justified will only be known with time, and whether indeed it will be necessary to think of other measures to bring about that change in consumption which we do need. So with those thoughts, let me thank you for your attention and wish you fruitful discussions for the rest of the webinar. Thank you.